Aaron, you had a really interesting piece over at the Daily Caller, and this was something that caught my eye for a variety of reasons. But we've been hearing a lot about the FACE Act. This is something that I think a lot of Americans might not have much of an idea about. They may not know much about it, and yet it's being used increasingly so, particularly when it comes to pro-lifers who are protesting at abortion clinics. Can you tell us a little bit about the FACE Act and what it is? Let's start there.
Yeah, for sure. So the FACE Act stands for Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. It was instituted in 1994 under the Clinton administration. And if you go to the DOJ's website, its stated purpose is to protect access to reproductive health, which is a euphemism for abortion, but that's the language they use. However, it also extends toward pro-life pregnancy resource centers, as well as houses of worship, so churches, for example. And if you go on the DOJ's website, you'll notice that they say the FACE Act extends to houses of worship because the right to assemble, freedom of religion, that's protected by the First Amendment. So the FACE Act is supposed to apply to pro-life counseling and churches, other houses of worship. However, what pro-lifers and conservatives have long claimed is that actually this act is really just a cudgel that's being used to target pro-life activists. And for the longest time, we didn't have the data to really substantiate that. And now we do. And this is the first time it's been published.
Well, and looking into that data, which is what you had a chance to do, and in light of those claims that you just mentioned, what exactly did you find? What did you discover? And what were you thinking and feeling as you were sort of navigating that data?
Yeah, so this data is from the DOJ, the Department of Justice, and it was obtained by Chip Roy's office, and it was provided to the caller. And the data shows there are approximately 211 cases, and around 97% of those cases were targeted at pro-life or anti-abortion activists. So people who are demonstrating at an abortion clinic, exercising their right to protest. Of course, I should note there are definitely cases in where people commit crimes other than violating the FACE Act. For example, making a violent threat. So there are certainly instances, and I'll touch on that later. But what's notable is that, particularly under the Biden administration, prosecutions ramped up dramatically. So the Biden's DOJ is responsible for over a quarter of all FACE Act prosecutions in the law's 30-year history, which is pretty significant. And he's also responsible for about 24% of the cases targeting pro-life activists. So in 2023, there are 5 people who did attack pro-life resource centers, and they were charged under the FACE Act. However, that's 5 activists out of all of the hundreds of cases of churches being vandalized, and arson attacks, pro-life pregnancy centers being targeted. So the prosecutions are wildly leaning towards one side, targeting one side of the abortion debate. And then another thing.
Can I just ask you one? I wanted to ask you one thing there. I just wanted to pause there for a minute because this is interesting to me because the critics will say, oh, well, it's because the pro-lifers are out there and they're protesting more and there's more of these events. Mm-hmm. But you just mentioned something important. And this was something that was not getting a lot of attention outside of conservative and faith-based media, which is that when the Dobbs decision leaked before the overturning of Roe, there started to be these attacks on churches. How many? I mean, I don't know if you know off the top of your head, how many of those attacks do you think there were on churches and pregnancy centers during maybe the last 2 years?
Yeah, so Catholic Vote, they're an organization who's done a lot of, they track these attacks. And I think from May 2022, there were about 400 attacks on churches, Catholic churches specifically. So that's not even including other denominations. And then on pro-life pregnancy resource centers, over 90 attacks. And it's also important to note that the data they gathered was collected from people at these resource centers reporting attacks. And there are probably a lot of people who didn't report instances of vandalism just because they didn't want to draw attention to their clinic. So I would say those are probably conservative numbers. But like I mentioned previously, only 5 people under Biden's DOJ who have attacked pro-life pregnancy centers have actually been charged under the FACE Act. So it's, there's definitely an imbalance there.
Yeah, and that has been the concern, as you were saying, that there was this imbalance. There's another element of this case as well, because the FACE Act, when you're found guilty of it in these cases, you could face up to 10 years in prison, correct? It's up to a decade in prison.
So that's with the conspiracy against rights charge, which is a separate law. So historically, in the history of the FACE Act, what you'll see is, especially in its infancy, you'll have people that have done wildly worse things than civil disobedience. So making threats. There's actually an instance under the Clinton administration where a self-described anti-abortion activist, he parked 2 trucks outside of an abortion clinic, and these trucks were similar to the vehicle used in the Oklahoma City bombing. And so the bomb squad was called in, the arson investigators were called in, and the trucks were empty, thankfully. But he was sentenced to mental health counseling, I believe 4 years of probation. He had to pay a small fine. Fast forward to now, under Biden's DOJ, you have elderly women, such as in the case of Paula Harlow, who are being sentenced to 2 years in prison for peacefully praying in an abortion clinic, not making violent threats, certainly not making bomb threats. So the sentencing is wildly disproportionate, and we can track how that's changed. So going off of that, the conspiracy against rights charge, that's a separate law that was enacted in 1870, I believe as part of the Enforcement Act. And what it was designed to do was to protect the voting rights of recently enfranchised African Americans. So, and it applies to 2 or more people. So 2 or more people cannot conspire to prevent someone from accessing their constitutionally protected rights. And what's interesting to note, especially in the cases of the FACE Act, is that the Biden Department of Justice's argument is essentially that you cannot conspire to prevent someone from accessing their constitutionally protected right to abortion. However, as you noted, with the Dobbs decision and Roe being overturned, I mean, you can't really make that argument anymore that abortion is protected by the Constitution. So, and I talked to Steve Crampton over at the Thomas More Society, who represented Paul Vaughn, who your listeners may know he was targeted by Biden's DOJ for praying outside of an abortion clinic in Tennessee. He stated that essentially what Biden has done is he's twisted this law designed to protect fundamental constitutional rights, and he's using it to target people practicing those rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion.
I mean, how often, and maybe we don't know the answer to this, was this 1870s law used in FACE cases, let's say, in FACE Act cases before the Biden administration? I mean, was that a prevalent way of sort of handling this, or is that a new dynamic within this administration?
It's entirely unprecedented with respect to the FACE Act. So it's certainly been applied in other cases not regarding voting rights, but with respect to FACE and people who are protesting abortion, or even people on the pro-choice side who are protesting pro-life resource centers. Like the conspiracy against rights charge has not been applied to those cases until now. So this is really historic in a concerning way. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. For you as somebody, working as a journalist, coming into this, pulling this data together and hearing for so long what the accusations, the claims were, seeing these cases unfold, but now having that data, what's sort of going through your heart and your mind as a journalist, but also as a human being, as you're looking at this and seeing the sentences that some of these individuals, particularly the elderly individuals who, maybe they blocked an entrance, but they were praying, they weren't violent. What do you make of this? How do you process it?
I went to it with an open mind because I know that obviously I have my own bias with regards to the abortion issue and what Biden's DOJ is doing, but I went into it with an open mind. I thought, well, maybe pro-life activism has really ramped up. Maybe there are increased instances of aggression and violent threats. And that's not what I discovered. So it's certainly concerning that such a powerful institution as the federal government is being weaponized in such a way. I mean, I mentioned Paul Vaughn. His home was raided by FBI agents, and thankfully he escaped jail time. But it's incredibly concerning that we live in a free country where the feds can just barge in on someone's door and arrest them for exercising their First Amendment rights. So it is concerning, but I don't want to leave your listeners feeling, frightened or scared of the future in America. It actually gives me hope that we were able to obtain this data and publish it for the public to see, because, and as I mentioned with Paul Vaughn, he did escape jail time. So it's not hopeless. Your freedoms are, we still have constitutionally protected freedoms. It's just people need to be aware when laws are being abused, especially for political reasons. And once you have that knowledge, you can be empowered to do something about that and make change.
Well, and the Mark Hawk case is another one that was alarming, and that was a case where, and you would have more of the details than I would off the top of my head here, but where you have somebody who's not inside of the clinic, they're outside. Mm-hmm. There's an altercation going on involving his son and a person from that clinic who is essentially arguing with him, and that was a very strange one because the feds also showed up to his house and terrified him and his family. Did they not?
They did. The FBI agents did show up at his door, and he was acquitted, I believe. So that's another instance in which we actually did get justice. But unfortunately, especially, one case, I mentioned Paula Harlow. So she protested in an abortion clinic in D.C. And the judge that sentenced her, she was appointed during the Clinton administration. According to court records, when Paula's husband basically was pleading with the judge, like, her health is declining, she's elderly. According to court records, the judge actually mocked her faith. And you can read about that in my article, what she allegedly said. So that's very concerning that we have people who are delivering these sentences that are not only just targeting someone's political persuasion, but also something as deeply and personally held as one's faith. So, going through the data and looking at all these cases, it's, you get worried, but I would say that now that we have this information, hopefully Congress can do something about it. So I try to have a more positive outlook.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you breaking down the data and looking at this and helping us better understand the issue. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.